On the 17th of April 2021, in the stripped-down circumstance of a country managing the final months of a pandemic that had rearranged every public occasion it touched, the funeral of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, took place in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. There were 30 mourners. Not the hundreds who would have lined the nave in an ordinary year, not the foreign heads of state and senior politicians and representatives of the 800 organizations of which he had been patron for decades, not the massed regiments and household officers and the wide extended circle of families and friends and connections that a man accumulates across 99 years and a long public life. 30 people, reduced to that number by the pandemic restrictions that had stripped the occasion of every piece of its usual architecture and that had in doing so removed something else, the cover that architecture provides. The Queen sat alone in a pew across the aisle from the other mourners. Black dress, black hat, black mask, 6 feet of empty chapel between her and the nearest other person. She was 94 years old. She had been married to the man in the coffin for 73 years, 4 months and 20 days. The photograph of that pew, the small, composed, black-clad figure in the enormous stillness of an emptied chapel, traveled around the world within hours, and people who had not given much thought to the Queen in years found themselves looking at it for longer than they expected, trying to identify what made the image both wholly expected and entirely startling. What made a very old woman sitting alone in a pew produce the specific quality of feeling it produced. The palace had released the full guest list in advance of the service. 30 names, public and complete, short enough to read in 2 minutes. It was read very carefully by a specific category of person. The people who understood that a funeral guest list paired to 30 for a man who had been at the institutional center of the British monarchy for 7 decades was a document that would reveal things that longer lists conceal. You read past the princes and the dukes and the immediate family members, past the household representatives whose presence required no explanation, and the military figures whose attendance was appropriate and expected. And you found, sitting in that list as a plain matter of public record, a name that some people recognized and most did not. Penny Knatchbull, Countess Mountbatten of Burma. She was 38 years younger than Philip. She had been married since 1979 to Norton Knatchbull, who held the Mountbatten earldom through his grandfather, Lord Louis Mountbatten, Philip's uncle, his patron since boyhood, the man who had organized Philip's entire early adult life in Britain after the collapse of his own family. She had known Philip through the Mountbatten connection for years before the relationship between them developed into something those close to the household as considerably more than a family connection explained. She came regularly to Wood Farm, the cottage on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, where Philip had lived in effective retirement since 2017. She came more than anyone else. She read to him in the long winters when his eyesight was failing. The household staff at Wood Farm knew the schedule. The senior courtiers at Buckingham Palace knew the schedule. The Queen knew the schedule. Sources close to the household confirmed, in the measured language that royal staff use when describing arrangements that were not secret but were never publicly discussed, that the Queen had insisted Penny Knatchbull would be on the funeral list. There had been one, source said, some quiet questioning from advisors. The questioning had not prevailed. The Queen had been clear, Penny would be there. The accommodation that the Queen had been extending to her husband's particular friendships since November 1948, the word particular used in the palace's specific institutional sense, meaning what the palace always meant when it used words carefully, ended here, in a chair in a chapel at Windsor, placed there by the woman who had sustained the accommodation across 73 years. To understand what that chair meant and what it cost the woman who placed it there, you needed to go back to the beginning of the story, not to the wedding in November 1947, but further, to the man who arrived at the marriage and what he brought with him, and to the formation that had produced him long before he stood at the altar of Westminster Abbey in the uniform of a Royal Navy lieutenant. with a hangover from his stag night at the Dorchester the previous evening, and began the performance of a marriage that would last 73 years and be described by the world as one of the great love stories of the 20th century. The description was in its essential outline true. It was also considerably less than the full picture. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The marriage of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip was presented in its official versions as the great love story of the British monarchy, a model of mutual devotion that endured through empire's end and political crisis, and the sustained personal disasters of the children's marriages and the death of Diana and everything else the 20th century provided. The presentation was sustained by the palace communications apparatus, by the sympathetic biographers who received the palace's cooperation and understood the terms of that cooperation, and by a British press that had developed across decades a complex relationship with the royal family in which access and coverage and institutional goodwill operated on terms that both sides understood and neither fully articulated. The presentation was true in the specific sense that the Queen's love for Philip was genuine, deep, total, and permanent. She had decided at 13 that he was the person she would marry, and she had not at any point in the following 83 years given anyone around her reason to think she had revised the decision. That love was real. No one who observed the Queen over 7 decades of public life in Philip's company has produced a credible account suggesting that the love was performed rather than felt. The witnesses closest to her, in private, the ladies-in-waiting, and the private secretaries and the senior household officers who attended her across the full arc of her reign, have consistently described, in the careful fragments they have allowed into the record, the quality of a love that operated without conditions and without revision, and without the diminishment that time ordinarily produces. The other side of the official version, the part that presented the husband's commitment as matching the wife's in its completeness and constancy, was where the official version ended and the other version began. The other version was known to the senior household at Buckingham Palace, to the small circle of friends who had drunk with Philip at the Thursday Club in Soho in the 1950s, to the staff of the royal residences who had been around long enough to understand what they were observing, and to the women, across 5 decades of the marriage, who found themselves drawn into Philip's orbit and who paid, in their various, whatever the orbit cost them. This is the story of those women and that pattern, assembled from the historical record as it currently exists. The biographies, the accounts of household staff, the published testimony of people who knew Philip across the various phases of his life, the documents that have entered the public domain through legal proceedings and freedom of information requests, and the pattern itself, which is perhaps the most reliable document of all. Patterns in the lives of powerful men with absolute privacy protection and a lifelong silence as their operating policy are harder to fabricate than any individual incident. And the pattern here is clear. Philip was not a man who arrived at the November 1947 wedding as someone whose romantic history could be described as patient waiting for his princess. He was 26 years old. He had spent the previous 5 years, in the period after his exceptional wartime service, in the particular post-war social world of London that the late 1940s produced for young men of his background, connections, and physical gifts. The gifts were considerable. He was extraordinarily good-looking in a way that required no allowances. Tall, blonde, blue-eyed, the product of Greek and Danish royal genetics that had produced in his generation several people of striking physical appearance. And specifically in Philip, a combination of looks and physical bearing, and the confidence that 5 years of active naval service deposits in men who come through it intact. He had commanded a destroyer flotilla off Sicily at 21. He had been mentioned in dispatches at the Battle of Cape Matapan for his role in operating HMS Valiant searchlights during the most decisive Royal Navy night engagement of the war. He had invented, during a German night bombing raid on HMS Wallace in 1943, the improvised smokescreen decoy that saved his ship and its crew. He arrived at peace with the specific authority of someone who had done real things in dangerous conditions and had performed well. He also arrived with the social formation that the Thursday Club had been producing since 1947, and it was a formation that the marriage was not going to dissolve. The club met weekly on Thursdays at Wheel Oyster Restaurant on Old Compton Street in Soho, in a private dining room upstairs, that the proprietor Bernard Walsh provided on the understanding that the patronage was good for business, and the discretion was the condition of the patronage. The founder was Baron Nahum, universally called Baron, a small, intense, dark-eyed man of Italian-Jewish background who had served as a Royal Navy photographer during the war and emerged from it with an exceptional list of contacts and an exceptional facility for the kind of glossy, charming, slightly artificial society portraiture that the post-war glossy magazines required in large quantities. Baron had photographed Lord Mountbatten at Broadlands. He had photographed Philip and Elizabeth in the weeks before the wedding. He had become, through the specific alchemy of talent and social intelligence that builds such positions, the semi-official portraitist of the younger royals and the wider Mountbatten circle. He was the connective tissue of Philip's social world in this period, the man who knew everyone and could introduce anyone to anyone else, and who ran the Thursday Club as the institutional expression of a social world that needed an institution. The membership was officially undefined. The regulars, assembled from the fragments that have entered the public record across 6 decades, included Baron himself, Prince Philip, Mike Parker, the actor David Niven, the actor Peter Ustinov, the actor James Robertson Justice, the harmonica player Larry Adler, the editor of at least one major Fleet Street daily, several naval officers who had served with Philip in the Mediterranean and the Pacific during the war, and a rotating cast of journalists, photographers, and the kind of well-connected, professionally amusing men of the immediate post-war years who understood without needing to be told that what happened at Thursday Club lunches was not something that traveled outside the room. They had lunch. They drank in the considerable quantities that the house wine Bernard Walsh provided encouraged. They told stories. They competed in the specific aggressive masculine sociability that English boarding schools and naval messes had been producing in men of their class and generation for as long as those institutions had existed. They left in the middle of the afternoon, in a condition that was not always suitable for public scrutiny. What happened after the lunches was the subject of sustained disagreement between the more vivid accounts of the period and the denials that surviving members produced when directly questioned. The most extensive version held that the group decamped from Wheeler's to other premises, where entertainment of a more comprehensive kind was provided. Every surviving member denied this when asked. The version appeared in every major biography of Philip, written since the late 1960s. The truth is in the zone that British libel law and professional discretion have made impossible to enter with certainty, which is itself a form of information about where the truth is located. The Thursday Club met from 1947 onward. Philip married in November 1947. The Thursday Club continued to meet after the marriage without pause or adjustment. There was no period in which the social world the Thursday Club represented and the marriage existed separately. They were concurrent from the beginning. The concurrence was not accidental. The pattern was established 10 days before the birth of the first of their 4 children, and it was established in a way specific enough in its circumstances to serve as a template for everything that followed. Pat Kirkwood was 27 years old in November 1948. She was among the most celebrated female entertainers in Britain, a stage actress and dancer of genuine distinction, whose career had been building since the mid-1930s, and who had by the late 1940s reached the level of recognition that fills West End theaters on the name alone. She was appearing at the Hippodrome Theatre in London that autumn in a show that generated full houses and consistently enthusiastic press. She was, by every account of people who saw her in this period, exceptional. Baron Nahum had been backstage at the Hippodrome. The introduction of Philip to Kirkwood was, by the pattern it set, significant. Baron made the introduction. The evening moved from backstage to dinner at L'Ambassadeur to the Milroy nightclub on Park Lane, and Philip and Kirkwood danced together until the early hours. A single other companion was present for at least part of the evening. The mechanics of the evening were the mechanics of the Thursday club social world. The photographer impresario, the entertainment venue, the dinner, the nightclub, the dancing. The princess was at Buckingham Palace. She was 8 months pregnant with the future King Charles III. She had not been informed of the evening's plan and was not present. The gossip columns reported the dinner the following day. The dancing at the Milroy appeared in subsequent days. The rumors of an affair began immediately and attached to Kirkwood's name with the specific permanence that rumors achieve. When the person most capable of addressing them decides that addressing them is not in his interest. Kirkwood denied the affair from the day the rumors began until her death in 2007, 59 years later. She maintained the denial in letters she deposited for release, only to Philip's official biographer, whenever such a person is eventually appointed. Those with knowledge of those letters expect them to confirm the denial. The evening was probably not the beginning of a romantic relationship in the precise sense that the rumors alleged. It was the beginning of something considerably more significant: the pattern. He had done what he wished in the company of a woman who was not his wife. He had not adjusted his evening's plans to accommodate the fact that his wife was 8 months pregnant. He had danced at the Milroy until the early hours. When the press began reporting the evening and the rumors began circulating, he produced nothing in response. Not a denial, not a clarification, not a single public sentence about the nature of the relationship or the circumstances of the evening. He produced silence, and he expected the palace machinery to manage whatever the silence did not contain, and he expected his wife to absorb whatever the management did not. Both expectations were met. They would continue to be met for the next 73 years. The damage the evening caused Kirkwood was not the evening itself. The evening could have been managed, practically and publicly, if the person primarily responsible for its consequences had chosen to manage it. The damage was the 5.5 decades that followed, in which the rumors attached to her name as a permanent fixture of her public reputation, generated by Philip's behavior, and sustained entirely by Philip's silence. He could have ended the rumors with a single public statement at any point between 1948 and his death in 2021. The statement could have been short. It could have been entirely true. He never provided one. The specific cost of this to Pat Kirkwood was the specific cost to a professional entertainer of having her name permanently associated with a rumor about the heir apparent's husband. The press did not forget the evening at the Milroy, the dinner at L'Ambassadeur, the dancing, the 8-month pregnancy. The combination of details was the kind of combination that tabloid journalism processes into a narrative and retains indefinitely. Every time her name appeared in the press across the following decades, the Milroy story appeared with it, often in the first paragraph, always in the piece somewhere. She spent her professional life managing a reputation that had been permanently compromised by one evening she had not arranged, and had spent the subsequent decades being invited to confirm or deny. She said, in the interview with Michael Thornton in the 1990s, that has preserved her voice on this subject, that a lady was not normally expected to defend her honor, that it was the gentleman who should do that she would have had a happier and easier life if Prince Philip had gone home to his pregnant wife on the night of the 4th of November 1948, instead of coming uninvited to her dressing room. The words are in the historical record. Philip was alive when she said them. He never answered. The policy of silence deserves its full accounting because it was not passive and not accidental, and not the product of good advice from cautious palace lawyers. It was an active, deliberate, sustained decision maintained across 73 years without a single recorded deviation, and it was the mechanism that made the entire pattern sustainable across those 73 years. He had established the policy in 1948, and he kept it for the rest of his life, through every press storm and rumor and biography and foreign newspaper investigation. Not one direct statement. Not one public sentence on the subject of his private life beyond the official engagements and the relationships they produced. Not one accommodation of a biographer's questions on the subject of any specific woman in his orbit. The senior household at Buckingham Palace, which operated on his behalf and produced official statements when official statements became unavoidable, issued exactly one statement on the subject of the marriage's health across 73 years. In February 1957, a single sentence, under press pressure that had finally exceeded the institutional threshold for silence. One sentence in 73 years, the silence served multiple functions simultaneously. It protected him from the legal and reputational exposure that confirmation would have produced. It protected the particular friends from the confirmations they were not positioned to survive professionally. It protected the marriage from the public confrontation that acknowledgement would have forced. It maintained the operating space within which the relationships could continue. It distributed the cost of the ambiguity to the women, who were left to manage their own reputations against rumors they had not generated and that the person who had generated them refused to address. The asymmetry was the point. The silence protected him and cost the women. The theft lasted 73 years. The protection was total. The cost was theirs. The arrangement was so efficiently asymmetrical that it operated for 7 decades without producing a single deviation on his side or a single public challenge on the women's side that he was required to address. The machinery worked because the ones at the center of the marriage had decided it would work, and because the women in the orbit understood that their position within the arrangement depended on their acceptance of its terms. The first particular friend after Kirkwood, whose relationship with Philip became the subject of sustained attention across decades, was Helen Cordet, and her story is the most complicated in the record because it spans 40 years of the marriage and involves allegations that have never been definitively settled, and contains within it a genuine historical relationship whose nature remains deeply ambiguous, precisely because the one person who could have clarified it chose, as he always chose, to produce nothing. Helen Cordet had been born Helen Foufounis in Athens in 1917. Her father was a prosperous Greek merchant, her family part of the connected upper-class Athenian world that had known Philip's parents. The Foufouni family had helped Prince Andrew and Princess Alice during the early years of the exile after December 1922, when the 18-month-old Philip had been carried aboard HMS Calypso in a hurriedly cushioned orange crate by a British naval attaché and removed from Greece, never to return. The connection between the families was specific and historical. It preceded Philip's memory. Philip and Helen grew up alongside each other in Paris in the 1920s, in the suburb of St. Cloud, where the exiled Greek community had concentrated around the small house lent to Prince Andrew's family by Princess George of Greece. They were both children of specific displacement, children of people who had lost their country and were managing the loss with varying degrees of grace in a French suburb that was not, and would never be home. Helen was 3 years older than Philip. The childhood friendship was genuine, documented by multiple independent sources from the Paris years, and of the specific kind that shared displacement produces. A bond built on the understanding that you were both somewhere you did not quite belong. When Helen married an Englishman named William Kirby in 1938, the 17-year-old Philip attended the wedding as her best man. The Kirby marriage did not survive. Helen became involved with a French aviator, Marcel Boiseau, with whom she had 2 children before they eventually married. Max was born in 1943, Louise was born in 1945. Philip became godfather to both children, a formal relationship that carried the specific social weight that godparentage carried in the Greek Orthodox and aristocratic worlds they had grown up in, which was considerable. What followed over the next 4 decades was not ordinary godparentage. He paid a significant portion of Max Boiseau's school fees at Gordonstoun, the Scottish boarding school on the north coast of Scotland that had produced Philip himself and that he regarded, in the specific way that people regard formative institutions, as the right place for a boy who needed to be made into a particular kind of man. He helped Helen establish a London cabaret career after the war. He provided introductions, used the social currency that his institutional position made available, helped her secure bookings and connections in the entertainment world she was attempting to enter. Helen Cordet performed at the Saturday Club through the 1950s and built a career of modest but real success. Philip's intervention had contributed to the building. The combination of the parentage and the educational support and the career assistance produced one of the most persistent rumors of his life, that Max Boisseau was Philip's son. The rumor was repeated in various forms in every biography of Philip, published since the late 1960s. It circulated in gossip columns across multiple countries for 50 years. It appeared in every newspaper profile of Philip written after the Thursday Club stories broke in 1957. It was still circulating at the time of his death in 2021. Everyone directly involved denied it. Helen denied it in her 1961 memoir, Born Bewildered, in language that several critics characterized as strategically insufficient, present enough to be on the record, specific enough to constitute a denial, but lacking the flat declarative confidence that fully settles a question of this kind. Max Boisseau denied it in 1988 when he was a professor of management at a Spanish business school and continued denying it until his death from cancer in 2011. He spent 50 years, the full span of his professional adult life, managing a question about his own parentage that the one person who could definitively have closed the question chose to leave open. Marcel Boisseau was on the record as his biological father. The biological claim has never been disputed by anyone with direct access to the relevant evidence. The denial is almost certainly accurate. The reason the rumor persisted despite the denials was not evidence. It was the pattern. When the Helen Cordet relationship is placed alongside the Pat Kirkwood relationship, and the relationships that followed across the following 3 decades, the specific texture of it, the sustained 40-year contact, the school fees, the career support, the proximity, looks not like an isolated friendship that attracted unfair speculation, but like one instance of the consistent arrangement in which Philip maintained close relationships with women outside his marriage, in which the nature of those relationships was never publicly acknowledged, and in which the cost of the ambiguity fell entirely on the women rather than on Philip. He maintained contact with Helen Cordet until her death in 1996. The contact stretched across 4 decades of the marriage. The Queen knew Helen. The Queen accommodated the friendship with the same composure she deployed for all the particular friends. The accommodation was complete. It did not falter in 40 years. If you're following this story, please take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It helps us keep making this kind of content, and I always love hearing from the audience. The Britannia tour of 1956 to 1957 was the event that closed the Thursday Club period and produced the only official palace statement about the state of the marriage that the institution released across 73 years, which is a remarkable fact about a remarkable institutional silence. Philip had been pressing for an extended Commonwealth tour since at least 1955. The case he made was that the Commonwealth countries needed regular reinforcement of their connection to the Crown in the post-Suez years, and that a long sea voyage visiting the Antarctic, Australia, New Zealand, and British territories in the Pacific and Indian Oceans would serve the purpose. The argument was accepted. The tour ran from October 1956 to May 1957, 5 months aboard the royal yacht Britannia. The Queen remained in London. Philip sailed. Mike Parker was aboard the Britannia throughout. Parker was still Philip's private secretary, his closest male friend, the man who had been organizing the practical architecture of Philip's social life since 1947. They had served together in the Mediterranean in 1942, had met on a destroyer flotilla off Tobruk, had recognized immediately the specific compatibility of men in shared danger who understand each other's approach to risk and pleasure. By 1952, Parker was Philip's private secretary. By 1956, he had been occupying that role for 4 years and had developed the operational fluency of someone who had been doing the same job long enough to do it without thinking. The 5 months on the Britannia produced what 5 months at sea with a specific social world always produces: an intensified version of the social patterns that existed on land. The long stretches between port visits required entertainment. The entertainment took the forms available to senior naval officers on a royal yacht in international waters. The accounts of officers who served on the Britannia during the tour have, in the decades since, emerged in fragments, in the careful language of people describing events they were required to participate in, and are not legally free to characterize directly. The fragments assemble into a picture consistent with what the surrounding circumstances suggest. The Crown's dramatization presented it as a 5-month stag event, with Parker writing letters home, describing it in those terms. The specific attributed language was invented. The wider implication was not. The trouble broke in early February 1957, when Eileen Parker filed for divorce in the London courts, citing adultery. The correspondent named in the petition was not Philip. The British press, operating under libel laws that prevented them from writing directly what they were thinking, wrote everything around what they were thinking, with the practiced precision of journalists who had been doing exactly this for their entire careers. Parker was Philip's closest friend. Parker had been with Philip on the Britannia for 4 months. Parker's wife had filed for divorce on grounds of adultery. The inference was available to any reader without assistance from the press. The American press was less restrained. The Baltimore Sun on the 8th of February 1957 reported that gossip in London held that the Duke of Edinburgh was romantically involved with a woman he met regularly at the West End studio of a society photographer. The society photographer was Baron Nahum. The woman, by every inference available to anyone reading the piece with knowledge of Philip's social world, was a figure in the Thursday Club circle, whose name the American papers had been told by their London correspondents, and which they did not publish, for reasons that were prudential rather than ethical. The palace issued its sentence. It was quite untrue that there was any rift between the Queen and the Duke. The sentence was received by the entire British press corps as the kind of official denial that confirms the underlying concern rather than addresses it. Nothing is true, as the journalism of the period had established as a professional maxim until it has been officially denied. The palace's single sentence produced more press attention to the marriage than any of the preceding stories had generated, because it represented the breaking of an absolute silence on the subject of Philip's private life. And that breaking was itself a statement about what the silence had been protecting. The palace statement itself merits its own accounting because it is the only one of its kind in the 73-year record, and its specific language reveals more about the institution than the institution intended. The statement was issued on the 8th of February 1957, the same day the Baltimore Sun story appeared. It was issued through the office of the press secretary at Buckingham Palace, and it read in its entirety: "It is quite untrue that there is any rift between the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh." 15 words. The press secretary, whose name appears on the statement, had been performing his role within the palace communications apparatus for years and understood, as every person in that role understands, the specific technique of the denial that acknowledges rather than settles. The statement was not false. It was constructed with the care that palace press statements always receive when the person responsible for the construction knows that the statement will be scrutinized for every syllable. The word rift is doing important work in those 15 words. A rift implies a specific deterioration of the central relationship, a rupture, a break, a defined moment of damage to the bond itself. The statement denied the rift, and the denial was probably accurate. The Queen's relationship with Philip had not ruptured. It had been operating since 1948 on the specific terms she had decided it would operate on, and those terms, while not what any person outside the palace would have chosen, were not a rift in the sense the word implies. She had not broken from him. She had absorbed what he was and decided 9 years into the marriage, that the absorption was what the marriage would be. This was not a rift. The palace was technically correct. What the palace did not address in those 15 words was the question that the Baltimore Sun and the British press were actually raising. What Philip had been doing on the Britannia for 5 months, and with whom, and with what consequences for the marriage, and whether the departure of his closest friend and private secretary 3 weeks after returning from the tour was coincidental or causal. The silence around these questions was not new, having been the palace's operating policy since 1948. But the production of a statement addressing a specific version of the question that no one had asked, while leaving the actual questions entirely untouched, was a specific and practiced institutional technique. The press received it as such. The circulation of stories about the marriage in the British papers increased in the week following the statement. The statement had the effect of turning the background noise into a story. Nobody at the palace commented on this. The press corps noted it and moved on, because moving on was what the arrangement required. Parker resigned 3 weeks after returning from the Britannia. The palace characterized the resignation with the institutional decorum it deployed for such transitions as Parker's own decision taken to spare the royal family further embarrassment. The reality, attested by multiple subsequent accounts, was that the Queen Mother and the senior household had concluded that Parker's continued presence in the consort's office was incompatible with the dignity of the institution. He was removed. He returned to Australia. He maintained for the rest of his life an absolute silence about the Britannia tour, publishing a brief memoir in his final years that revealed nothing substantial about any of it. He died in 2001. The silence held. Baron Naum died of a heart attack in September 1956, 3 weeks before the Britannia tour began. Without him, the Thursday Club lost its center. The lunches continued for a few months after Parker's departure from the household in early 1957. And then, as social institutions do when they have lost their 2 most important members within 6 months, they thinned out and stopped. Bernard Walsh retired from the management of Wheelers. The private room upstairs was no longer reserved. By the early 1960s, the Thursday Club was effectively dissolved. The Soho years were behind him. What was in front of Philip was a different world and the same pattern. The 1960s brought a shift in the texture of the particular friendships without altering their essential structure. The Thursday Club's institutional housing was gone, and with it the most visible expression of Philip's bachelor social world. But the underlying arrangement was not dependent on any specific institution. It was built into how he lived, and it continued, after the dissolution of its institutional housing, through the following 3 decades, in different settings, with different women, and with the same essential mechanics. The world Philip moved through in the 1960s and 1970s was the world of the English county house and the aristocratic sporting calendar. Shooting parties, the hunt meetings, the annual migration to the Balmoral estate in Scotland, the round of visits between the families who had known each other across generations and whose social world produced regular encounters in the specific settings he preferred. He was the consort to the sovereign and the patron of 800 organizations and the manager of the private family in the operational role he had taken on in 1952, attending an average of 350 official engagements a year across the 1960s and 1970s. He was not an unoccupied man. The official life was full, and the private life ran alongside it in the same compartment system that Philip had operated since the first year of the marriage. The particular friends of this period moved through the same circuit Philip moved through. They appeared at the same houses, the same shoots, the same occasions. They were, with a consistency that those who knew his social world regarded as a genuine preference rather than accidental tendency, almost invariably married. Philip had been choosing married women since the late 1940s, and the choice had not evolved across the decades in any direction that made it less consistent. The preference was practical in the ways that made it attractive. Married women in the class he operated within understood the specific kind of discretion that their situations required. Their husbands were, in most cases, men Philip knew from the same networks, and the husbands, in almost every case that has entered any record, behaved in public with a cheerful equanimity that was either genuine indifference or the practiced composure of men who had made a specific calculation and found it acceptable. The household's term for the women in this category was his particular friends, and the phrase was used with the consistency of official vocabulary by everyone who worked within the institution across the relevant decades. His particular friends. The phrase was technically accurate, and it was doing the specific work that official language always does, which is to acknowledge an observable fact while declining to characterize it in any way that forces the institution to address what the fact contains. The most specific allegation within the 1960s timeframe involves Susan Barantes and carries with it a particular quality of the operatic that the wider Philip story occasionally produces. Because if Andrew Lowney's 2025 account is accurate, what it describes is a situation in which the father of the groom and the mother of the bride rode in the same wedding carriage at Westminster Abbey in July 1986, through the streets of London waving to the crowds, having been lovers approximately 20 years before. Susan Barantes had been born Susan Wright, raised in the prosperous Anglo-Argentine social world that maintained close connections to Britain, and had married a British polo player, Major Ronald Ferguson, in 1956. Their daughter Sarah was born in October 1959. Susan left the Ferguson marriage in 1974, subsequently married the Argentine polo player Hector Barantes, and moved to Buenos Aires. She died in a car accident in Argentina in October 1998, leaving no public account of any relationship with Philip. Lowney's claim in The Rise and Fall of the House of York is presented as established fact rather than speculation. He writes that Philip and Susan Barantes had been lovers during the 1960s, while she was still married to Ferguson, and that at the wedding of Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson in July 1986, the two of them sat together in the third carriage through the ceremony procession. The sourcing is anonymous, retrospective, and dependent on sources who have not been publicly named. Sarah Ferguson has not commented in any detail. Philip never spoke about it. The claim sits in the same evidential territory as every other specific allegation about Philip's particular friends across the marriage. Consistent with the pattern, plausible given the pattern, unverifiable by the standards of the historical record as it currently stands. Denied by everyone with any reason to deny it. What cannot be denied is the carriage itself. Philip and Susan Barantes did share a carriage at the 1986 Westminster Abbey wedding. They did wave to the crowds together through the streets of London. Whatever the history between the two people in that carriage was or was not, Philip presented to the Kendra exactly what he had always presented when the subject was the women in his orbit. The composed, blank, uninformative face he had been presenting since November 1948. The blankness was not absence. It was the most practiced thing about him. The Duchess of Abercorn is the particular friend from the 1970s and 1980s, whose relationship with Philip has been described most directly on the public record, because she chose, after his death in 2021, to speak about it carefully, with the precision of a woman who had spent considerable time determining exactly what she was going to say and what she was not. Alexandra Hamilton, Duchess of Abercorn, had been born Sasha Phillips in 1946 and married the 5th Duke of Abercorn in 1966. She was 25 years younger than Philip. She was the mistress of Barons Court, the Abercorn family estate in County Tyrone in Northern Ireland. A house and estate of the scale and atmosphere that Philip found wholly congenial. Philip met her in the early 1970s at the University of Cambridge, where she was studying, and the friendship developed across the following years into something that, by the late 1970s, had become, by every account of those who observed Philip's social arrangements, one of the most consistent presences in his particular circle. He visited Barons Court. He wrote to her letters in his specific and vigorous handwriting that were the mode of communication he preferred for the people who mattered to him. He discussed things with her, by her own subsequent account, that he felt unable to discuss in other contexts. He spent time in her company at the various royal and county occasions that brought them into the same places, and the time he spent was, by the consistent observation of those who attended the same occasions, different in its quality from the time he spent in other social company. He was more present, he was more engaged. The attention that he deployed in her direction was the full attention, not the portion of attention that official occasions require. After Philip's death in April 2021, the Duchess gave an interview to the writer Giles Brandreth. The interview was published as part of Brandreth's work on Philip's life and character, and it has become one of the most analyzed pieces of testimony in the post-death assessment of the marriage. The Duchess spoke with the careful, practiced specificity of a woman who had decided what she was going to say about a relationship whose public description required very exact management. She said Philip had needed a playmate, someone with whom he could push limits, someone who could match him intellectually and hold his attention in the full sense of holding it. She said there were things he could discuss with her that he was unable to discuss elsewhere. She said he had loved her. She said she had loved him. In the next sentence, she said the relationship had been platonic. The combination of those words, loved her, loved him, platonic, is the combination that any historian or biographer receives with the attention that carefully constructed public testimony warrants. The word platonic was placed there by a woman who understood precisely what it was doing and chose it with full knowledge of what it would accomplish. It allows the relationship to be publicly acknowledged as important, emotionally significant, sustained, the word love used twice in both directions, while closing off the characterization that confirmation of a physical relationship would have forced. The Duchess is alive. The estate has legal protections. She chose her words with the precision of someone choosing words that will be examined for the rest of her life. What the words leave in their wake is the space they were designed to maintain, the space between loved her and platonic, in which the pattern of Philip's private life has operated since 1948, and in which every particular friendship from Kirkwood onward has existed. The space is the silence reshaped into the form of careful speech. Philip visited Barons Court regularly across the late 1970s, 1980s, and into the 1990s. He wrote letters. The household at Buckingham Palace managed what it was required to manage. The Queen knew about the Duchess of Abercorn. The Queen met the Duchess at the various occasions where their paths crossed. The Queen treated her with the specific calibrated warmth that she had been deploying with Philip's particular friends for 30 years, by the time the Abercorn relationship was at its most prominent in the record. The calibration had not grown mechanical with repetition, it remained precise. It was the product of 30 years of sustained professional practice applied to exactly a specific management challenge. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment. I would love to know what you're making of this story and where you're watching from. The Queen's accommodation is the central fact of the marriage. It has been consistently understated in the official accounts because the official account required it to appear as the absence of something, the absence of conflict, the absence of confrontation, the natural smoothness of a stable and devoted partnership, rather than as what it actually was. The presence of something extraordinary, a sustained 73-year act of professional-grade emotional management performed at the highest possible level of consistency without a single publicly visible deviation. The Queen was not a woman who was unaware of what she was accommodating. The institutional head of an organization as well-staffed and as attentive to its own internal affairs as Buckingham Palace does not become unaware of things that the household is actively managing. The household knew, the senior private secretaries knew. The ladies-in-waiting, who were closer to the Queen's daily life than almost anyone, knew. The master of the household knew. The information was available to anyone who needed to have it, and the Queen was the person who needed to have most things. She had decided to accommodate the pattern because she had made that decision actively in the first years of the marriage, and she had never revisited it across the subsequent 7 decades. The decision is worth understanding in its full context because it is among the most consequential decisions any public figure made in the 20th century, and because understanding it requires holding simultaneously several things that resist simple combination. She had decided at 13 that she would marry Philip. The decision was made with the specific psychological completeness of certain adolescent commitments, the ones that are made at sufficient depth that subsequent experience accumulates around them rather than revising them. By the time she actually married Philip in November 1947, the decision had been so completely absorbed into the architecture of her identity that no development of the subsequent marriage was likely to produce a revision of the foundational commitment. She loved him. The love was not conditional on his behavior. She had not arrived at the marriage with a set of behavioral requirements that, if not met, would constitute grounds for revision. She had arrived with the decision, made 8 years earlier, that he was the person, and the decision had been made before the evidence was available. The second reason for the accommodation was institutional. She became queen at 25. She had 2 small children, a husband who had just had his naval career terminated against his will by the death of her father, a household of 300 people, a constitutional role she had not been adequately trained for, and a country managing the largest economic and imperial transition of its modern history. She did not have the capacity, in the most practical sense, to fight with her husband about the social arrangements he was maintaining. She could not afford a public marital crisis. The institutional damage of any public confrontation over his behavior would have been calculable and considerable, and she could calculate it. She assessed it, and she accepted the terms that avoided it. The third reason was generational, and she would not have described it in analytical terms, because it was not something she had analyzed. It was something she had absorbed. She had been raised by parents whose marriage was a model of absolute mutual devotion. Her father had loved her mother without reserve. Her mother had loved her father without reserve. The marriage of George VI and Queen Elizabeth had been the central emotional example of her childhood, and it had deposited in her, at a depth below conscious articulation, the conviction that marriage was permanent, that permanence was managed rather than negotiated, and that the correct response to the imperfections of a marriage was accommodation rather than confrontation. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. These 3 reasons together produced the decision. The decision produced the accommodation. The accommodation produced the long discipline of absorbing everything that Philip's arrangements generated and continuing to function at the full capacity of her public role, without a single publicly visible moment of strain on a subject across 73 years. The discipline required was extraordinary in the specific sense that it was practiced daily across 7 decades. It required her to meet with warm courtesy every woman in Philip's particular circle from 1948 onward. It required her to conduct herself in public with Helen Cordet across 40 years of the Cordet relationship, and with the Duchess of Abercorn across the Baron's court years, and with Penny Knatchbull across the carriage driving years and the wood farm years, and the final chapter at Windsor, as if each of these women were simply a family friend or a member of the wider social circle that surrounded the royal family. It required her, on every occasion when those women were in her company, to produce nothing that could be read by any observer as acknowledgement of the specific context in which they existed. The senior household, asked in the years after Philip's death about the specific quality of this dynamic, produced the same language with a consistency that indicated a shared understanding of something they had all observed from the same angle over many years. She had decided very early. She had made a decision, and the decision was permanent, and it operated as the foundation on which everything else in the marriage rested. The decision was not resignation, and it was not passive acceptance. It was the active, professional management of a marriage on terms she had set herself, without requiring anyone else's approval, and had maintained without revision across 7 decades. One fragment of her own voice on the subject of the marriage survives in the public record. In the speech she gave at their golden wedding anniversary dinner in November 1997, the same year Diana died, the same year the family was working its way through the worst institutional crisis of the century. She described Philip as a person who did not take easily to compliments. She said he had been her strength and stay for 50 years. She said she owed him a debt greater than he or any of them would ever know. The words were warm. They were public. They were carefully constructed. They said what she had decided to say, and nothing beyond it. They said nothing about the accommodation. Nothing about what the strength and the staying had cost her. Nothing about the specific nature of the debt she was describing. The speech said everything, and concealed its central fact, which was that the greatest part of the debt was not owed to him, but by him, and that she had chosen across 50 years to describe it in the other direction. He sat across from her at that anniversary dinner in the way he had always sat across from her at public occasions, with the complete and focused attention that every observer noted and that no one who watched them together across 70 years of official occasions ever doubted. He looked at her at those moments with something that operated independently of everything else that was happening in his private life. Whatever the particular friends represented, whatever the pattern contained, when he was sitting across a table from the Queen at a public occasion, the attention he directed at her was real. The attention was not the same thing as the love she had given him. Nothing in the record suggests that his feeling for her matched hers for him in its completeness or constancy, but the attention was not nothing. She was perhaps the best observer in any room she occupied across 70 years of professional public life, and she received the attention for what it was. She had given him everything, and he had given back what he was able to give back, and she had decided very early that what he was able to give back was what the marriage would have. Penelope Knatchbull had been born Penelope Eastwood in 1948, the same year as the future King Charles III, and married Norton Knatchbull in 1979. Establishing through that marriage the formal connection to the Mountbatten family that made her, in the technical genealogical sense, related to Philip. Norton held the earldom through his grandfather, Lord Louis Mountbatten, who had been Philip's uncle, patron, and the single most important adult figure of his early life. The man who had taken him in when his own family collapsed in 1930, and whose murder by the IRA in August 1979 had produced in Philip the most publicly visible grief of his adult life. The relationship between Philip and Penny developed from this family connection in the gradual way of such developments. They moved in overlapping circles. They attended the same events through the Mountbatten family network. The relationship between them was not, in its initial phase, anything beyond what it formally was. The connection between an older man and a younger woman who were both attached, through different relationships, to the same extended family. The event that shifted the relationship's register was specific. The Knatchbulls' youngest daughter, Leonora, was diagnosed with a kidney condition in the late 1980s. She died in 1991 at the age of 5. Philip responded to this with a quality of attention that those who observed the early period of the developing friendship described in the careful language of people who had watched Philip across his adult life as unusual for him. He reached across the institutional and generational distance that his formation normally imposed on his emotional responses. He provided what his position and his energy made it possible to provide. He organized, he appeared. He was present in the operational sense. That was the sense in which he was capable of presence. He introduced Penny Knatchbull to carriage driving. This was not a casual social gesture. Philip was seriously invested in carriage driving by the 1980s, having developed the interest as a competitive alternative to sailing when sailing became physically impractical. He had driven competitively at major events across Britain and Europe, had acquired the specific technical knowledge that years of serious practice produce, and he coached Penny with the same attention he brought to the sport itself. She was an excellent student. She became competitive in her own right, participating in the same events at which Philip was a regular presence. They trained together. They competed at the same meetings. They occupied the same social world of the competitive carriage driving circuit, which is a small world and closely networked, where the same people encountered each other across the long competitive seasons and developed, through regular contact over years, the familiarity of people who have shared the same specific obsession over time. The Royal Press Corps noted the consistent presence. The coverage of the relationship between Philip and Penny Knatchbull was one of those areas where the British press of the period operated with specific restraint that characterized its approach to subjects. It understood well enough to handle carefully. The relationship was documented in photographs. It was discussed in private by journalists who covered the royal family. It was not treated, in the mainstream British press, as a story requiring the explicit characterization that would have forced the palace to produce a second official statement on the state of the royal marriage, which would have been the first since the single sentence issued in February 1957. Both sides of the implicit arrangement, the press and the palace, understood the terms. The palace characterized the relationship as a family friendship through the Mountbatten connection. The Queen met Penny Knatchbull. The Queen was gracious. The Queen treated her with the calibrated warm courtesy that the Queen had been deploying with Philip's particular friends since 1948, a practice now approaching its fifth decade. The calibration had not grown mechanical with repetition. It remained precise. It was one of the most sustained professional performances in the history of the British monarchy. Philip retired from public duties in August 2017. He was 96 years old and had been, by the accounts of those who had been recommending retirement for several years, ready for longer than he was willing to admit. He had attended 22,000 solo official engagement since 1952. He had given 5,093 speeches. He had been the patron of 785 organizations. He had walked behind his wife at 22,000 official occasions over 65 years, 2 steps behind her. Sus, in the constitutional position of the consort, performing the public role with the absolute reliability of someone who understood that the performance was the price of the private arrangements. He moved to Wood Farm, the cottage on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk that had been his private retreat across his adult life, and he made the move in the specific, complete way that those around him understood as deliberate. He wanted to be at Wood Farm. He did not want to be at Buckingham Palace or at Windsor. He wanted the distance from London and from the institutional weight of the monarchy and from the schedule that the institution required. He had given the schedule 65 years. He wanted the cottage and the Norfolk land and the company he chose. The Queen was at Windsor and at Buckingham Palace and at Balmoral in the rotation that had governed her working life since 1952. Philip was at Wood Farm. The geography of the marriage in its final years was the geography of 2 people who had organized their domestic lives separately, spoke by telephone daily, and came together at the scheduled occasions that the royal calendar and their shared family life required. The senior household managed the logistics with the competence it had been developing for managing Philip's arrangements since the 1940s. Penny Knatchbull came to Wood Farm. She drove from Broadlands, the Mountbatten family estate in Hampshire, to the Norfolk coast and stayed for periods of several days. The household staff at Wood Farm knew the schedule. The pattern of her visits had the regularity of something that had been operating in various forms and at various locations since the early 1990s. She managed the small staff that maintained the cottage with the easy authority of someone who had been part of the place's life for years, an authority not asserted but present in the way that long familiarity with an environment produces authority in people who are comfortable in it. She read to him. His eyesight had declined across the final years at Wood Farm to the point where reading independently was difficult. He had been a serious reader throughout his adult life, with the wide-ranging intellectual curiosity that his official biographical treatment accurately described, and that the staff who knew him from close range confirmed from their own direct observation. He had read history and biography and natural history, and the technical literature of the various fields that engaged him: conservation, industrial design, the applied sciences, the practical engineering of the things he used and cared about. The loss of the reading was its own specific loss, layered on top of the larger losses of the retirement years. Penny read to him through the Norfolk winters. The reading was not a gesture or an occasional kindness. It was a daily practice maintained with the regularity of something that both of them had incorporated into the routine of the shared life they had developed at Wood Farm across the final years. The long winter afternoons in the Norfolk light, or the absence of light, with a specific settled quality of two people who have found their way to this particular domestic arrangement after a very long time and have stopped finding it remarkable. His final illness began in February 2021. He was admitted to King Edward VII's Hospital in London on the 16th of February with what was officially described as an infection. He was transferred to St. Bartholomew's Hospital in early March for a procedure on a pre-existing heart condition. He returned to Windsor Castle on the 16th of March. He died there on the morning of the 9th of April 2021 at 99 years old, 2 months short of his centenary. He had outlived Pat Kirkwood and Helen Cordet and Baron Noam and Mike Parker and Lord Mountbatten and the specific 20th century world that had formed him. He had outlived the Thursday Club and the Britannia and the Empire and most of the institutions that had housed the life he had built. He had not outlived Penny Knatchbull, who was 72 when he died, and who was at Wood Farm when the news came to her. The palace released the funeral guest list 3 days before the service. 30 names, public and complete. The list was read very carefully by the people who understood what a list that short would contain and what its specific composition would reveal. The Queen had allocated 10 of the 30 chairs to the immediate family. She had given chairs to senior household representatives, to military and institutional figures whose presence was appropriate and expected, to members of the family's close inner circle. And she had given 1 chair to Penny Knatchbull. The sources who subsequently confirmed the story of how that allocation had been made spoke in the language that palace sources use when describing decisions that were made and are not going to be undone. There had been some quiet questioning from advisors. The questioning had not prevailed. The Queen had been clear. Penny would be there. The quiet questioning is worth sitting with for a moment. The advisors raising it were doing their jobs, which included managing the public presentation of every piece of the institutional communication the palace produced. And the guest list of a 30-person funeral for the Duke of Edinburgh was among the most closely examined documents the palace had produced in years. Penny Knatchbull's presence on a list of that length, against the backdrop of decades of coverage of her association with Philip, was a presence that the advisors understood would be analyzed and discussed. They raised the question. The Queen heard the question. The Queen answered it, which was that Penny would be there, and the advisors absorbed the answer with the professional composure of people who had spent careers absorbing the Queen's answers. The chapel on the 17th of April 2021 was the stripped version of what a full state funeral would have been. The coffin on the Land Rover Defender that Philip had spent 10 years designing with the Royal Engineers. The color chosen, the dimensions specified, the engineering of the loading platform designed to his instructions. He had designed his own hearse. The completeness of the self-determination the design represented, the man who took what he wanted and gave back what he chose to give back, controlling the last vehicle he would ever ride in, was characteristic in the way that the most revealing details always are. The 30 chairs were arranged in the chapel at the pandemic distances that had imposed their strange geometry on every gathering of the preceding 14 months. The service was brief. Philip was interred in the royal vault beneath the chapel. The 30 mourners dispersed. The Queen returned to the castle. Penny Knatchbull left Windsor. The accommodation that had begun in November 1948, 10 days before the birth of their first child, at a nightclub on Park Lane in London, ended here. It had run for 73 years. It had been extended to Kirkwood and to Cordet and to the unnamed woman of the 1957 Britannia stories, and to the particular friends of the 1960s and 1970s County House Circuit, and to the Duchess of Abercorn, and to Penny Knatchbull. It had been extended consistently, without deviation, without a single visible faltering, by the woman who had decided in the first year of the marriage that this was the accommodation the marriage required, and who had not revisited the decision. The chair at the funeral was the final expression of the decision. It was the acknowledgement by the wife that the last companion had been real, that the relationship at Wood Farm had mattered, that the 3 decades of carriage driving and winter afternoons and shared domesticity at the Norfolk cottage deserved the specific recognition that placement on a funeral list of 30 provides. The Queen had known about Penny Knatchbull for 30 years. She had accommodated her for 30 years. She gave her a chair at the end. The historical accounting of what the pattern contained across 73 years is not, at the point the record currently stands, complete. The sealed archives at Windsor hold papers that biographers have been waiting on since Philip's death in 2021. Pat Kirkwood's letters remain in the vault. The official biography of Philip has not yet been commissioned, which means the person the letters are to be released to has not yet been identified, and the letters have not yet been read by anyone who will be in a position to describe their contents publicly. The biographers working on the available fragments have not yet completed their work. What can be assembled from the sources currently available? The biographies, the household testimony, the published accounts of the particular friends themselves, the fragments that have entered the public record through various channels across the decades, is the outline of the pattern, specific in its shape if not yet complete in every particular. The pattern had 7 clear markers across the decades. Pat Kirkwood in 1948, the first and most clearly damaged. A woman whose professional reputation was permanently affected by rumors Philip generated and chose not to address for 59 years. Helen Cordet across 40 years, whose son spent 5 decades defending his own parentage because the ambiguity Philip maintained was cheaper for him than the clarity that a single direct statement would have provided. The unnamed woman of the 1957 Britannia coverage, whose identity has not entered the public record and may not. The particular friends of the 1960s and 1970s County House Circuit, documented in the aggregate rather than the individual in the available sources. Susan Barant-Tays, if Lowney's 2025 account is accurate, who left no account of her own, and whose daughter married Philip's son. The Duchess of Abercorn, who loved him and said it was platonic, and left the historians to occupy the space between those statements. And Penny Knatchbull, who was given a chair at the funeral. 7 markers, 7 decades, 1 structure repeated across all of them. The woman entered the orbit. The woman remained for years or decades. The Queen knew. The palace managed the press consequences. Philip said nothing. The women absorbed the costs of the ambiguity and managed what the ambiguity produced for their own reputations and their own lives, with whatever resources they had available. The costs were paid differently by each woman, over different time scales, and with different instruments. But they were paid in every case, and in every case they were paid by the woman rather than by Philip, which was the consistent structural feature of every relationship in the pattern across 73 years. Pat Kirkwood paid the longest. She was 27 when the Milroy story broke, and 86 when she died, and the story was with her for 59 of those years. A rumor about a specific evening attached permanently to her public identity, in the way that specific details attached to public identities when the one person capable of contradicting them has no interest in contradicting them. Her professional life was built on public appearances. Her professional name was her commodity. Every time the name appeared in print, the Milroy appeared nearby. She gave one major interview on the subject to Michael Thornton in the mid-1990s, and the interview reads, in its careful language, its restrained precision, its refusal to see anything that could constitute a legal complaint against a living member of the royal family, like the account of someone who has been managing the same situation for 50 years and has developed the particular discipline of sustained, practiced restraint that long management produces. She said she had an unfortunate knack of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. She said she would have had a very different and a far easier career if things had been different. She said it was the gentleman's responsibility to clear the lady's name, that this was what a gentleman did, and that a lady was not normally expected to defend her own honor. The words are in the record. The implication is in the record. The target of the implication was alive when she said them, was at Buckingham Palace when she said them, was patron of 800 organizations, and the subject of sustained public celebration as the devoted husband of a beloved queen when she said them. He provided nothing in response. The cost to Helen Cordet was of a different order. She had known Philip since childhood. The friendship was real in the sense that all genuine childhood friendships from shared displacement are real. The cost she paid for the friendship was the combination of three things that operated simultaneously across the 4 decades of their adult relationship: the sustained rumor about her son's parentage, the professional complexity of being the woman whose career advancement was known to have benefited from a well-connected patron, and the specific form of social damage that attaches to a woman whose reputation for discretion about powerful men becomes the most publicly noted thing about her. Max Boyceau paid the subsidiary cost of his mother's connection with Philip. 5 decades of fielding questions about his own biological origins in a period when such questions were routinely asked in print as well as in person. Without the social protections that the 21st century would eventually construct around the discussion of family circumstances. He was a professor of management. The banks were at their most persistent in the public record. A serious intellectual figure whose work on knowledge management and organizational theory was read by people who came to him for his scholarship, and sometimes found themselves writing about the Godfather question instead. He died in 2011. The question followed him to the last year of his life. Philip was still alive in 2011. He was 90 years old and still performing official duties at 90, and he continued to perform them in the specific composure of a man for whom the 70-year-old questions had ceased to register as requiring response. The particular friends of the county house circuit of the 1960s and 1970s paid what the women in such arrangement always pay when the arrangement operates over years rather than months. The slow absorption of a secondary social identity that exists alongside the primary one and shapes how the people who know both identities understand the person. Their names are mostly not in the public record in any specific connection to Philip, and their relative anonymity is itself the product of the same discretion system that the other women had moved through. The system in which the wife knew, the household managed, the press contained itself within understood. Susan Barantes had been born Susan Wright, raised in the prosperous Anglo-Argentine social world that maintained close connections to Britain, and had married a British polo player, Major Ronald Ferguson, in 1956. Their daughter Sarah was born in October 1959. Susan left the Ferguson marriage in 1974, subsequently married the Argentine polo player Hector Barantes, and moved to Buenos Aires. She died in a car accident in Argentina in October 1998, leaving no public account of any relationship with Philip. Lowney's claim in The Rise and Fall of the House of York is presented as established fact rather than speculation. He writes that Philip and Susan Barantes had been lovers during the 1960s, while she was still married to Ferguson, and that at the wedding of Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson in July 1986, the two of them sat together in the third carriage through the ceremony procession. The sourcing is anonymous, retrospective, and dependent on sources who have not been publicly named. Sarah Ferguson has not commented in any detail. Philip never spoke about it. The claim sits in the same evidential territory as every other specific allegation about Philip's particular friends across the marriage. Consistent with the pattern. Plausible given the pattern. Unverifiable by the standards of the historical record as it currently stands. Denied by everyone with any reason to deny it. What cannot be denied is the carriage itself. Philip and Susan Barantes did share a carriage at the 1986 Westminster Abbey wedding. They did wave to the crowds together through the streets of London. Whatever the history between the two people in that carriage was or was not, Philip presented to the Kendra exactly what he had always presented when the subject was the women in his orbit, the composed, blank, uninformative face he had been presenting since November 1948. The blankness was not absence. It was the most practiced thing about him. The Duchess of Abercorn is the particular friend from the 1970s and 1980s, whose relationship with Philip has been described most directly on the public record, because she chose, after his death in 2021, to speak about it carefully, with the precision of a woman who had spent considerable time determining exactly what she was going to say and what she was not. Alexandra Hamilton, Duchess of Abercorn, had been born Sasha Phillips in 1946 and married the 5th Duke of Abercorn in 1966. She was 25 years younger than Philip. She was the mistress of Barons Court, the Abercorn family estate in County Tyrone in Northern Ireland, a house and estate of the scale and atmosphere that Philip found wholly congenial. Philip met her in the early 1970s at the University of Cambridge, where she was studying, and the friendship developed across the following years into something that, by the late 1970s, had become, by every account of those who observed Philip's social arrangements, one of the most consistent presences in his particular circle. He visited Barons Court. He wrote to her letters in his specific and vigorous handwriting that were the mode of communication he preferred for the people who mattered to him. He discussed things with her, by her own subsequent account, that he felt unable to discuss in other contexts. He spent time in her company at the various royal and county occasions that brought them into the same places, and the time he spent was, by the consistent observation of those who attended the same occasions, different in its quality from the time he spent in other social company. He was more present, he was more engaged. The attention that he deployed in her direction was the full attention, not the portion of attention that official occasions require. After Philip's death in April 2021, the Duchess gave an interview to the writer Giles Brandreth. The interview was published as part of Brandreth's work on Philip's life and character, and it has become one of the most analyzed pieces of testimony in the post-death assessment of the marriage. The Duchess spoke with the careful, practiced specificity of a woman who had decided what she was going to say about a relationship whose public description required very exact management. She said Philip had needed a playmate, someone with whom he could push limits, someone who could match him intellectually and hold his attention in the full sense of holding it. She said there were things he could discuss with her that he was unable to discuss elsewhere. She said he had loved her. She said she had loved him. In the next sentence, she said the relationship had been platonic. The combination of those words, loved her, loved him, platonic, is the combination that any historian or biographer receives with the attention that carefully constructed public testimony warrants. The word platonic was placed there by a woman who understood precisely what it was doing and chose it with full knowledge of what it would accomplish. It allows the relationship to be publicly acknowledged as important, emotionally significant, sustained, the word love used twice in both directions, while closing off the characterization that confirmation of a physical relationship would have forced. The Duchess is alive. The estate has legal protections. She chose her words with the precision of someone choosing words that will be examined for the rest of her life. What the words leave in their wake is the space they were designed to maintain, the space between loved her and platonic, in which the pattern of Philip's private life has operated since 1948, and in which every particular friendship from Kirkwood onward has existed. The space is the silence reshaped into the form of careful speech. Philip visited Barons Court regularly across the late 1970s, 1980s, and into the 1990s. He wrote letters. The household at Buckingham Palace managed what it was required to manage. The Queen knew about the Duchess of Abercorn. The Queen met the Duchess at the various occasions where their paths crossed. The Queen treated her with the specific calibrated warmth that she had been deploying with Philip's particular friends for 30 years. By the time the Abercorn relationship was at its most prominent in the record. The calibration had not grown mechanical with repetition, it remained precise. It was the product of 30 years of sustained professional practice applied to exactly a specific management challenge. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment. I would love to know what The private arrangements were not in conflict with this acceptance. They were part of the same structure. He had accepted the constraints of the public role completely, professionally, without visible resistance or regret. The private life was the space the constraints did not reach. The particular friends were not a rebellion against the marriage or against the role. They were the form of private self-determination that a man of his specific formation, the exiled child, the rootless young man, the brilliant naval officer, whose navy had been removed from him, maintained as the price of the institutional compliance he had agreed to provide. The structure was everything public, completely and professionally. Everything private, according to his own preferences and at his own determination. The arrangement worked because the other person at the center of it was the woman she was. A less intelligent woman would not have seen clearly enough to make the foundational decision. A less disciplined woman would not have sustained the accommodation across 7 decades without a single deviation. A less secure woman would have required the confrontation that the confrontation would have cost and gotten less than the silence provided. The Queen was none of these things. She was, in this specific domain as in her broader professional life, among the most capable people of her century. She saw the arrangement with complete clarity. She made her decision. She maintained it. She gave Penny Knatchbull a chair. The relationship between Philip's formation and the specific form the pattern took across the marriage, the preference for married women, the sustained friendships of years or decades rather than brief episodes, the maintenance of discretion as an operating condition is consistent with a man who was not looking for excitement or variety. He was looking for the specific thing that his formation had not provided in childhood: sustained, genuine, affectionate connection with someone who understood him without institutional mediation, someone who was present for him rather than for what he represented. The women who occupied this role were not interchangeable, and they were not casual. They were, in every case where the record is clear enough to assess, people with whom he maintained genuine connection across years. Helen Cordet for 40 years, the Duchess of Abercorn across decades, Penny Knatchbull for 30 years. These are not the arrangements of a man conducting affairs for the sake of novelty. They are the arrangements of a man whose emotional life required something the marriage, as the marriage was constituted by its public demands and its institutional requirements, and by the specific asymmetry of loving a sovereign, could not fully provide. The Queen knew this. The senior household officers who spent careers observing both of them at close range knew it. The observation produced, in the people who have spoken about it publicly since Philip's death, the same careful formulation: that the marriage was real, that the love was real, and that the other arrangements were not a refutation of the marriage, but part of the same complicated structure that it was. The formulation is diplomatic. It is also within the limits of the diplomatic accurate. The biographers working on Philip Forsyth are operating against the specific archival challenge that the British royal family's record-keeping policies produce for anyone attempting to write about the private lives of its members with accuracy and completeness. Philip's private papers are at Windsor. The scale of the archive is substantial for a man who spent 73 years at the institutional center of the monarchy, who conducted an average of 350 official engagements per year across those 73 years, who maintained an extensive personal correspondence with the hundreds of people in his social and institutional circle, and who was constitutionally required to receive and respond to a portion of the correspondence directed at the throne. The papers documenting the public life are substantial. The papers documenting the private life are closed. The letters Philip wrote to the women in his orbit are in that category. The letters the Duchess of Abercorn received, which she has described in general terms without permitting their contents to be published, are part of the record that is not currently accessible. Pat Kirkwood's letters, deposited for release to the official biographer whenever that biography is commissioned, are in their vault. The correspondence between Philip and Penny Knatchbull across the 30 years of the most recent and most sustained of the particular friendships has not entered any publicly accessible archive. The Queen's own papers, which would include whatever documentation she kept of the private life of the marriage over 73 years, are subject to the same institutional controls that govern the royal archives generally. The biographers who have been most thorough in their treatment of Philip's life, Giles Brandreth, who had direct access to Philip himself in a series of conversations, and who had access to people close to the household over many years. Andrew Lowney, whose research across the full span of the Windsor papers and external sources produced the most recent major biographical treatment. Sally Bedell Smith, whose American perspective allowed certain topics a somewhat different register, have all worked through this territory with the awareness that the documentary record they are working from is a partial record by institutional design. Brandreth's Philip. His life and times is the most intimate of the major accounts because Brandreth had the personal relationship that produced direct observation and conversation across decades. And his account of the Abercorn friendship is more specific than anything else in the public record, because the Duchess chose to speak to him rather than to the institution's communications staff. Lowney's work on the House of Windsor has treated Philip's private arrangements more directly than the previous generation of biographers found institutional and legal conditions permitted. Bedell Smith's Prince Philip. A life is comprehensive and careful in the specific way of American royal biography, thorough in its sourcing and precise in its attributions, occupying the territory that the available record supports without extending beyond it. None of them has had access to the letters. None of them has had access to the full household record of the Wood Farm years. None of them has had access to whatever documentation exists in the palace files about the specific occasions when the household was required to manage the public consequences of Philip's private arrangements. The official biography, when it is commissioned and written, will have access to none of these until the sources have been reviewed by the institution's archivists and cleared by the institution's legal staff under whatever terms the official biography commission specifies. The official biography will be the most complete account. It will also be the most managed account. That is the nature of official biography when the institution being described is still active and still has strong operational interests in its own historical narrative. The specific challenge facing the future official biographer of Philip is not the absence of material. It is the opposite. The material exists in quantity, and the institution's interest in the narrative the material produces is substantial and active, and the biographer will be required to work across the gap between the completeness of the archive and the portion of the archive the institution is willing to release. The letters to the Duchess of Abercorn are one category. The letters to Penny Knatchbull, if they exist in any archival form and have not been destroyed, are another. The household staff records from Wood Farm across the final decade of Philip's retirement, the records of who visited, when, and for how long, which any competent household maintains as a matter of operational management, are a third. The private secretary's files from the period of the Thursday Club years, which would include whatever the palace's communications management produced in the period between 1948 and 1957, are a fourth. Each category would, if made available in full to a biographer with appropriate access and without institutional content restrictions, contribute significantly to the completeness of the historical account. None of them will be made available in that form. The official biography will receive what the institution decides the official biography should receive. The archivists will work through the papers with the care and these institutional interest that royal archivists bring to the papers of deceased members of the senior family. And the result of their work will be a curated collection from which the official biographer will produce the authorized account. The authorized account will be thorough within its limits and careful within its thoroughness, and it will be the most complete single document about Philip's life that will be produced by anyone with institutional access. The unofficial accounts, Brandreth, Lowney, Bedell Smith, and the biographers who will follow them as the decades produce their own reassessments, will work from the sources the institution does not control. The household testimony that escapes the official framework, the foreign archive material that British institutional reach cannot manage, the private accounts of the people who were present and who have chosen to speak, the patterns themselves, which are in the record, and which the record cannot revise. What will be in Pat Kirkwood's letters, when they are eventually described by whoever reads them, is one of the smaller remaining mysteries of the 20th century's royal record. The prediction offered by those who knew the letters existed, that they will confirm the denial of a romantic relationship, is probably accurate. The denial was consistent for 59 years. There is nothing in the record to suggest that a woman who maintained a public denial for 6 decades would deposit letters contradicting it. The letters will confirm the denial. The evening of the 4th of November 1948 will be clarified as what it appears most likely to have been: the first expression of the pattern, not the beginning of an affair. The pattern will be visible in the clarification. The letters will reveal a man who went where he wished with the women he found interesting, who did so without accommodation of his pregnant wife's circumstances, and who did not at any subsequent point produce the single public sentence that would have resolved the matter without cost to himself. The letters will be read by someone whose job is to write the official version. The official version will be careful. This is, after 40 years of waiting, the specific thing that Pat Kirkwood deserves. The careful official version of the evening that cost her 5 decades of professional and personal management, written with the full institutional access that she never had herself, by a person whose job will be to present it in the light most favorable to the institution. The careful official version is what she gets. She has been dead since 2007, and she cannot provide a response to the careful official version. That is also characteristic of the pattern. The version of Philip that the official presentation provided across 73 years was not a fiction. It was a selection from the available material. The selection chose the things that the institution wanted to show and managed the things that the institution preferred not to address, and the management was so complete and so sustained that the selection became, for most people who followed the British royal family across those 73 years, the full picture. The full picture, assembled from the available record, is more complicated and more interesting than the selection, and the complication is not a refutation of the selection. He was, as a matter of documented public record, one of the most effective royal consorts in the history of the British monarchy. He attended 22,200 official dinnings. He gave 593 speeches. He delivered an average of 350 engagements per year across 65 working years. He completed the full official schedule without a single significant public failure of the professional conduct the schedule required. He walked 2 paces behind his wife at 22,000 official occasions over 65 years, and he did it with the absolute consistency of someone who had made a decision about the public role and was not going to make it visible that the decision had cost him anything. He invented the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme in 1956, which has since delivered its specific form of character development to 8 million young people in 144 countries, and which is, in the field of youth development, one of the most successful programmatic achievements of the post-war British state. He was an early and sustained advocate for environmental conservation at a time when advocacy in that field from a senior royal figure was not fashionable and was not without institutional cost. He pushed the palace's communications apparatus toward the filmed documentary format that produced the 1969 Royal Family documentary, the first time the public had been admitted to the private life of the royal family through moving images, at a time when the institution's instinct was to resist any such admission. He managed the private family with the consistent operational competence that the role of family manager required, Through 4 children and 4 marriages, and the divorce and the death of a daughter-in-law, and the sustained institutional pressures of the post-Diana years, he was present, he was reliable. He did not produce, across 73 years in the public eye, a single significant lapse of the professional conduct his role required. There is a form of evidence about the marriage that is neither the official presentation nor the whisper network of the household, and it is perhaps the most reliable form available because it was produced continuously across 70 years in public view and cannot be retrospectively managed or revised. It is the photographic and film record of the 2 of them in the same room. The photographers who covered the royal family across the decades of the marriage have left, in their aggregate, a visual archive of a specific quality that is identifiable and that does not resolve into the simple categories of performed affection or institutional obligation. The images of Philip watching the Queen at public occasions, the specific angle of the attention, the quality of focus he directed at her when she was speaking, and he was positioned as the audience, are consistent across 65 years of documented public life, in a way that resists the explanation that the consistency was performed. Performance across 65 years, at the level of consistency, the photographic record shows would be the greatest sustained performance in the history of public life. The alternative explanation is that the attention was real. The household officers and the ladies-in-waiting, who were positioned closest to both of them across the marriage, have, in the fragments of testimony they have permitted into the public record, addressed this question with the characteristic care of people who have been choosing their words about the royal family's private life for their entire professional careers. The formulation they reached for, with a consistency that suggests a shared observation rather than a shared briefing, is that in the marriage essential axis, the 2 of them together alone or in company, Philip treated the Queen differently than he treated everyone else. He was attentive, he was present. He was careful in the sense of caring about the specific outcome of their specific relationship, in a way that the available record does not show him being careful of a seat in his institutional or private life. He moved through official occasions with the composed authority of someone who found official occasions manageable and not particularly interesting. He moved through occasions at which the Queen was present with a different register, a registered interest in her, that the observers noted as personal rather than institutional. The senior private secretary, who served under both Philip and the Queen in the middle decades of the reign, and who has given more detailed testimony to the authorized biographical record than most household officials of his period, said that Philip was the one person in the Queen's life who did not treat her as the Queen. He treated her as the person he had chosen. The choice had been made in 1947, and it had not been revised across 73 years. The private arrangements had not revised it. The particular friends had not revised it. The woman in the pew at Windsor in April 2021, in the black dress and the black hat and the black mask, 6 feet of empty chapel between herself and the nearest other person, was the person he had chosen. Whatever the pattern of the preceding 73 years had contained, it had not contained a revision of that. He also spent 73 years maintaining a structure that protected his own private arrangements at the cost of the women those arrangements involved. And he did so without any visible acknowledgement that the structure had costs, without any public accommodation of the damage those costs produced, and without any of the self-reflection that his public reputation for intellectual engagement might have suggested was available to him. The 2 accounts are about the same person. Neither account cancels the other. He was both things fully, across the full span of his life. He had asked for a fire at his desk at Buckingham Palace in 1952, when the death of the king had removed his naval career and installed him in the consort's role, and the Spitfire sat on his desk for the rest of his institutional life, a memento of the 5 years of genuine operational authority he had had, before the institution required him to trade it for a different and more constrained kind of public life. The staff who saw it on the desk understood what it was. He did not explain it. The carriage driving was its operational descendant, the adult expression of the same need, that the Spitfire commemorated. The need for a physical discipline that required technical mastery, that produced specific and objective results in competitive conditions, that operated according to rules that were not set by the institution, and that the institution could not adjust to accommodate his position. He learned carriage driving in the mid-1970s, when he was in his 50s, and the cricket and the polo that had served the same function in earlier decades had become physically impractical. He competed seriously, trained seriously, mastered the technical disciplines that serious competition required. He was good at it. The results were genuine, and they were achieved against people who did not adjust their performance because of who he was. In a life in which almost everything was adjusted, the competition mattered. He introduced Penny Knatchbull to carriage driving after Leonora's death in 1991. The introduction was an act of the specific generosity that Philip, according to the accounts of everyone who knew him well, was capable of when he chose to extend it, and that he extended most readily to people whose circumstances engaged him enough to produce it. He saw in her grief something that he could address through the thing he had that was most his own: the competitive sport, the physical discipline, the world of the carriage driving circuit, where the professional skills of the competition were what mattered. He had been giving people things across his adult life, and the most valuable things he gave were the ones that were most specifically his. Access to Gordonstown, career introductions, the technical knowledge of the thing he cared most about that year. The carriage driving was the thing he cared most about in 1991, and he gave it, in its most personal form, to the person he had decided to give it to. She received it, and she was good at it, and the good at it mattered to him. He did not extend himself across his adult life to people who were not up to the extended extension. The women who occupied the position of particular friend across the decades were, without exception, people whose intelligence and independence he respected in the specific way that people like Philip respect. By taking them seriously on their own terms, by engaging with what they had to say rather than with what their social position required them to say, by treating them as people rather than as components of the institutional environment. The particular friends he maintained for decades were particular because they could hold his attention, and holding Philip's attention across decades required being actually interesting, actually competent, and independent enough to tell him things that no one else in his institutional environment was positioned to tell him. Penny Knatchbull told him things. The specific content of the conversations at Wood Farm across the 30 years of the friendship is in the category of things that are known to the people who had them and not available to anyone else, which is the category that Philip's entire private life has occupied since 1948. What is on the record is the observation of the people who were close enough to the Wood Farm years to observe the quality of what they were watching, that the companionship was real, that it engaged both of them in the full sense of engagement, and that the winters in Norfolk with the books and the fire and the quiet schedule of the retirement years produced, for a man who had spent 65 years performing the public role in every condition the public role required, something that the public role had never been able to produce for him in 65 years. He was at peace at Wood Farm in a way that the people who knew the full range of his life's settings found distinctive, not resigned, not merely relieved to be outside the schedule. At peace in the specific sense of a person who has arrived at the circumstance that was closest to what he had been trying to find for a very long time, who has arrived there late, and who knows it. The funeral on the 17th of April 2021 was conducted according to the plan Philip had spent the preceding 20 years composing. The hearse was the Land Rover Defender he had begun designing with the Royal Engineers in 2003. When he was 82 years old, and had decided that the moment he had been aware was coming was close enough to be worth preparing for, he specified the color dark green. He specified the modifications, the ramp for loading the coffin, the extended wheelbase, the removal of the rear seats to accommodate the flag-draped coffin's dimensions. He confirmed the design in 2019. He had 2 years to look at it before he needed it. The choice to design his own hearse was noted by the people who covered the royal family as characteristic. It was characteristic. He had been doing the equivalent for most of his adult life, choosing the specific form of his own arrangements and executing the choice with the technical precision of someone who understood that the precision was the point. He had chosen the carriage. He had chosen the sailing routes. He had chosen Wood Farm. He had chosen the Land Rover Defender. The choices were all expressions of the same thing: the technical mastery of the specific situation, the refusal to arrive at circumstances unprepared, the preference for the self-designed over the inherited. He had inherited nothing, not a title that meant anything, not a country, not a family home. He had made everything he occupied. The hearse was the last thing he made. The coffin rode through the quadrangle of Windsor Castle, on the modified Defender, on a morning of April sun that had arrived with the specific improbable perfection that English spring occasionally provides. The family followed on foot. The Queen's private car followed the family. The 30 mourners were already in the chapel. The service proceeded according to the carefully prepared order of service, lasted 50 minutes, and accomplished what it was designed to accomplish: a dignified, specific, formally military commemoration of a man whose relationship to the institution he had served was not simple and was not required, on this occasion, to be explained. Penny Knatchbull was in her assigned chair. The Queen sat alone in her pew. The two women, who had known each other for 30 years, and whose knowledge of each other was the specific knowledge of two people who've occupied adjacent in the same man's life for 3 decades, were present in the same small stone room with his coffin between them. If there was anything exchanged between them in that room, a look, an acknowledgement, the specific recognition of two women who have been managing the same arrangement from their different positions across 30 years, it is in the category of things that are not and will not be in the record. What is in the record is the chair. The Queen put the chair there. She had been putting the chair there in its various forms across 73 years, the accommodation, the calibrated courtesy, the managed presence, since November 1948. The last chair was in the chapel at Windsor, and it was for Penny Knatchbull. And the Queen put it there because it was the right thing to do. And the right thing to do was also the final expression of the discipline the marriage had required of her, across its entire span. The specific historical context of the Philip pattern is worth placing against the wider context of mid-20th century royal marriage, because the comparison illuminates the specific nature of what the Queen managed across 73 years and why managing it required everything she had. The comparison that has become most available since the deaths of both Philip and Elizabeth is the one with their son's marriage to Diana, and then to Camilla. Charles had spent 12 years in an official marriage, from 1981 to the separation of 1992, while maintaining the relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles that had preceded the marriage, and that, by the accounts of everyone involved and eventually by Charles himself, had never actually ended. He then married Camilla in April 2005, and she is now the Queen Consort, the official title holding precisely what the 73 years of palace silence about Philip's private life had been designed to prevent: the acknowledgement at the highest institutional level of what the arrangement had actually contained. The comparison is instructive, not because the arrangements were the same, being structurally quite different in their timeline, in the nature of the women involved, in the institutional consequences they produced, but because it places the Queen's specific 73-year management of the Philip situation in the context of what happened when the management failed. When Charles's marriage disintegrated publicly, and when Diana's account of the Camilla relationship entered the public record through Andrew Morton's biography in 1992, and through her Panorama interview in 1995, the institutional consequences were the ones that the palace machinery managing Philip's situation had been designed across 50 years to prevent. The public acknowledgement, the public grief of the official wife, the public intervention of the parallel relationship into the constitutional narrative of the monarchy. The Queen watched it happen to her son's marriage. She had spent 50 years preventing it from happening to her own. the skill with which she had prevented it, and the cost of the prevention were visible in the contrast. Diana paid what she paid publicly and at speed and catastrophically, without the preparation or the institutional framework that might have contained the cost. The Queen paid what she paid privately and over 7 decades, and without a single moment of publicly visible accounting. The comparison is not between two women who were treated similarly by the institution. It is between two women who were given the same structural position and responded to it with completely different instruments, at completely different timescales, with completely different results. The result the Queen produced was the 73-year marriage that ended in St. George's Chapel in April 2021 with the chair. The result Diana's marriage produced is in the history books, with the specific weight that history assigns to very public tragedies. The comparison does not redeem the arrangement that the Queen since spent 73 years managing. It places the management in the context of the institutional forces that required it, and it suggests, with the specific suggestion of historical contrast, the magnitude of what was required to do it as it was done. The marriage of Elizabeth and Philip was a great love story. This is the thing that the official version presented, and it was and remains true in the most important sense of the thing. She had loved him since she was 13, had never revised the love, had built her adult life around it with the completeness that only a love of that kind produces, and had extended to him across 73 years an accommodation that required everything she had in the specific departments it required: intelligence, discipline, institutional authority, emotional resource. The love was total, the love was real. The marriage also contained a companion for nearly every decade of its 73 years, a pattern of particular friendships maintained outside its boundaries, with a consistency that made the pattern the most reliable document of the marriage private life. The two things coexist. They coexisted across 73 years of the marriage itself, managed by the woman at the center of the marriage with a skill that did not diminish across 7 decades, and they coexist in the historical record now that the marriage is complete. They are both true simultaneously. The accounting of the marriage that chooses one true thing and suppresses the other is incomplete in the same way that Philip's silence was incomplete. It is accurate as far as it goes, and it does not go far enough to be the whole picture. The whole picture is the one in which the Queen loved Philip without qualification for 73 years, and Philip maintained the specific arrangement across those 73 years that his formation and his nature and his choices made inevitable, and the women in the arrangement paid the costs of the ambiguity, and the Queen absorbed the costs she was required to absorb, and at the end of it, she placed a chair in the chapel at Windsor for the last of the particular friends. Because the love that had sustained the marriage across 73 years was also the love that required the acknowledgement, at the very end of it, that the last companion had been real, and that she had always known it, and had always, from the beginning, decided what to do about it. She placed the chair. She sat alone in her pew. He was in the coffin between them. 73 years, 4 months, 20 days. One sentence from the palace, issued in February 1957, on the subject of the marriage's health. One chair, placed at a 30-person funeral in April 2021, placed by the woman who had been managing what the chair represented since November 1948. The chair was the beginning of the end of the accommodation, and the end was as composed as everything that had preceded it. The Queen buried her husband, returned to the castle, and continued to function as the constitutional head of state for the United Kingdom for another 17 months, until her own death in September 2022 at the age of 96 at Balmoral, the estate in Scotland, where she had been most completely herself across her entire reign. She did not speak publicly about Philip's private life in those 17 months. She had not spoken publicly about it in the preceding 73 years. The silence was complete at the end, as it had been at the beginning. Penny Knatchbull attended the Queen's funeral at Westminster Abbey in September 2022. She was in the congregation. She was not on the official guest list that was analyzed by the people who analyze these things. And her presence at Westminster Abbey went largely unreported. And this was appropriate, because the story that had required the specific attention the funeral list of April 2021 had received was now complete. The chair had been given, the acknowledgement had been made. What followed was the ordinary business of continuing. The ordinary business of continuing is what all the women in the pattern had done across the decades, in their different circumstances and with their resources, managing what the pattern had deposited in their lives and going on from it. Pat Kirkwood went on from the Milroy until 2007. Helen Cordet went on until 1996. The particular friends of the county house circuit went on in the comfortable obscurity their greater anonymity provided. The Duchess of Abercorn went on to give Brandreth her interview, which she will have calculated with the care she brought to every public statement about the relationship, and she is still going on. Penny Knatchbull went on to Westminster Abbey in September 2022 and sat in the congregation and did not draw attention to her presence. Philip went on until April 2021, and he went on in his specific way, which was the way of a man who had decided very early what the arrangement was and had never revisited the decision, and who paid, in the end, the only cost he was required to pay, which was the same cost everyone pays at the end of their arrangement with the world. He had designed the hearse. He had specified the color. He had prepared as thoroughly as it is possible to prepare. If you've made it this far into this story, thank you. It's the kind of history that the official version doesn't give you, and that requires a longer form than most platforms allow. If you found it worth your time, please subscribe and leave a comment. He was interred in the Royal Vault, and then in April 2022, he was moved to the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor, where his wife would join him 6 months later. They are there now, together and in sequence, as they had been in the marriage across 73 years. Together and in sequence, the formal arrangement and the other arrangement running in parallel, both real, both permanent in their own way, neither of them complete without the other. The chair at the funeral was there too, for the record, for anyone who knew enough to read it correctly, which was how the Queen had always managed the information, making it available in the form of specific observable fact, for the people who knew enough to understand what they were observing, while providing nothing beyond the observable fact itself that required official acknowledgement or official management. The chair was the last piece of specific observable fact in the 73-year record. It was placed there by the woman who had been placing those facts in the record, in their various forms, since November of 1948, and who had understood since the beginning that the record would eventually be read by someone, and had decided very early that the record it would show was the one she was willing to let it show: a great love story, a long marriage, and a chair. That was the whole picture, or as much of the whole picture as the whole picture allowed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.